You are officially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery. This is my 10-week group program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your chances of conception, either now or in the near future, we have a spot for you. We start in January. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to register today. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 295. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today, I'm sharing a new episode in my Pill Reality series. If you're new to the podcast or you haven't heard many of the previous episodes in the Pill Reality series, make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/pillreality and you'll see the series of interviews that I've done with real women who are part of the Fertility Friday community who have just jumped in and shared their personal experience on birth control. And so we've gone through most, if not all, of the different types of birth control methods. So we've certainly talked quite a bit about the pill. Other methods that we've spoken about include the implant and the IUD, both the copper IUD and the hormonal versions of the IUD, and also the shot. So we have had a couple episodes about the shot. So it's really important and helpful to listen to these stories of real women, understanding that, of course, there is a huge range of how women experience hormonal birth control. One of the things that stood out to me in my conversation today with Katherine was her experience with healthcare providers. And so it's something that we've spoken about on the show quite a bit, how to navigate these types of conversations with your doctors, what to do if you do feel that you are having side effects and feel that they could very possibly be related to your birth control, and you're being told that either they're not categorically or really just your side effects are being dismissed. What do you do? So in today's episode, it gives a real understanding and picture of like, what do you do when you do educate yourself, where you have been informed, where you actually have found the label insert for your pill formulation or your hormonal birth control formulation. So you've actually read the manufacturer's information and you have some of the symptoms that are literally listed on the package insert, and your doctor's still basically telling you, it's in your head, this couldn't be related. So I think for a lot of women who've been in situations where either they haven't been believed or when their doctors have dismissed their symptoms or their concerns or just not even gave them the time of day, this episode is helpful in the sense that you know that you're not alone because it certainly happens to many of us, but also hopefully it will encourage you just to keep going. I mean, it's frustrating if you have this type of experience, but if you do, you just have to keep going. There are fantastic practitioners out there who will listen to you, who will support you, or at very least will remove your IUD if even if they disagree that it could be causing the symptoms, but will at least do it and at least help you remove it. So it's really important not to lose hope. And if you do have a negative experience with a practitioner, just remember there are lots of amazing practitioners out there who do respect their patients. And so if you haven't found that one really great practitioner yet, don't stop. Keep looking until you find them. So with that in mind, without further ado, let's jump into today's Pill Reality series episode with Katherine. And I'm really excited to be here with Katherine today. Katherine is a member of the Fertility Friday Facebook community. And anyone in there or who's listened to the podcast for a while will know that I'll occasionally just, post questions and just to get a sense of women's experiences. And so I posted a question about IUD experiences. And Katherine, you responded with quite the experience and the story. So I invited you to come on the show and share what it was like for you. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Well, I'm excited to have you. And as I usually do in these sessions, I would love for you just to paint the audience a bit of a picture, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your history when you got your period and kind of just what led you to on your birth control journey. So you use the IUD, you can tell us which one and just kind of how that came about.
Okay, so my first menstruation was when I was 13 years old in a ballet class.
The best place to have your first period. Exactly. When you're in a leotard. I did ballet for like a really long time, so I feel your pain. Oh my gosh.
So I definitely distinctly remember that. I think my periods were relatively uneventful. When I was about 16 years old, I went to my doctor for something unrelated, and he was like, "You have acne, why don't you take birth control pills?" So I started taking hormonal contraceptives around that time. I noticed a lot of my friends in high school had really similar stories with their physicians as well. They'd go in for something unrelated and magically they would be on hormonal birth controls around 16 or 17 years old. So I went through several different brands on and off for the better part of probably 8 to 10 years. I had a lot of different side effects. And finally, after taking a year off and then going back on NuvaRing, I had a lot of pretty severe emotional issues. I was very irritable. I was crying all the time. I was very depressed. A good friend asked me if I'd started hormonal contraceptive recently. I was like, yeah, I did. She's like, you need to stop that. You're a horrible person right now. Like, just go off of it.
Wow. Can we just hang out there for a minute? That's really, so you took the pill for a while, different ones, and then you took the NuvaRing, and you mentioned you had a bunch of side effects. The emotional side effects sounds like were more pronounced with the NuvaRing, but could you share with us some of the side effects you experienced?
I had spotting between periods. I had a bit of anxiety during my undergrad. I really do think that was attributed to the hormonal contraceptive I was on, because I've only had symptoms of anxiety when I've been on hormonal birth control.
And when you say anxiety, share with us. I'm always asking these questions to make it more literal so that other women who may have experienced that knows what you mean when you say that.
Overreactions to small things that would happen. Maybe I'd have a test coming up, and rather than just sitting down and studying for it, I would just panic. I had a few panic attacks during my undergrad as well, and that's only something that's happened while I've been on hormonal contraceptives.
And then the panic attack, for someone who's like never had one or never saw somebody have one, could you just describe what that was like?
It's kind of overwhelming fear comes over you, and I would generally hyperventilate until I had to either sit down or pass out.
That sounds horrible. Okay. And so also going back to what your friend said, it's interesting when you have so not all women have that kind of immediate severe, obviously, response. It's like there's a percentage of women who go on hormonal birth control and like their personality changes right away and like they become, I say this with love, like some version of like a raving lunatic. I think maybe that's not the right thing to say. But if your friend called you out, that's really interesting. So just go into that a little bit more because that's really interesting.
She's a really good friend. So she's allowed to tell me I'm being a terrible person. But she noticed that I was being very irritable. I wasn't going out as much. When I was there, I was really snappish and not my usual easygoing, nice self. So she picked up on that pretty quickly. I think she had a few other friends with similar experiences, asked if it was hormonal contraceptives, and highly advised I stop them.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I mean, a lot of women have experiences with that, but she kind of, from whatever her experiences had been, that was like her first thing, which is interesting that she picked up on that.
She's been really good about picking up on that sort of thing because when she went on hormonal contraceptives when she was 19, she had suicidal idealization.
Wow.
So she's kind of been an advocate for people not being on hormonal contraceptive. And then my friend group has been really good about picking up on mood side effects.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's, I suppose it's a blessing that you had someone to point it out right away. So you went on the Nuva ring, it changed your emotional state, and then your friend was like, "What's going on?" And then did you go off of it? And then what happened after that?
I went off of it for about a year. I was looking for another form of contraceptive. The same friend recommended a copper IUD as a non-hormonal option. So I went and I got a Flexi T.
Okay. And then the
Which
emotional stuff, like when you went off of
cleared
the
up
Nuva ring.
cleared up immediately after I went off of NuvaRing.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now copper T, that sounded fancy. Say the name again.
So I had a copper IUD inserted. I had it for 5 years, but the insertion process went okay, I guess. The doctor gave me an ibuprofen 45 minutes before the insertion, scheduled the insertion close to my period so my cervix would be dilated, and gave me misoprostol to help with the dilation process.
Mm-hmm. And so for women who don't know, misoprostol is one of it's often used in abortions to help dilate.
Yes. And the pain of insertion only lasted about 40 seconds, but it was one of the more intense pains I'd experienced in my life.
Yeah, we were talking in the pre-chat about how this has come out as a theme.
Mhm.
So I was sharing with you that when I do these episodes, I don't have a script or anything. I just ask questions based on where the conversation goes. That's typically my interview style for anyone who listens to the podcast. And so when I've been doing these reality series episodes and asking about how the insertion was for all the women who have used the IUD at some point, it's a very consistent part of the story that the pain may not last very long, but it's always excruciatingly painful for a period of time. And so this is with the ibuprofen, with the misoprostol to dilate the cervix, choosing a time of the cycle that's supposed to be easier to insert and still being really painful. So if you had to describe it, compare it to something, what could you compare it to?
Very, very, very intense menstrual cramps.
Okay. Well, and I could completely imagine women who really had a positive experience with their IUDs saying, like, what's the big deal? It was only 40 seconds. Like, really, in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing, right? Because it's over. Some women do talk about having kind of cramps throughout the rest of the day, though. But what would your response be to that type of sentiment?
I think for a lot of people, it could be a good option of contraception as long as they're aware that it is going to be painful. It might be worth it for some women.
And so having experienced that pain, what do you think? I mean, we probably aren't going to solve this problem today on today's podcast. I think it's a little bigger than that, but having gone through it, what do you think could even be done? I personally, I find it really interesting that the area isn't numbed. And I've heard women say things like the doctor telling them, "Oh, there's no nerve endings. You won't feel," like I've heard people say things like that.
So that's really interesting because I did have an IUD replacement, and when they put in my new IUD, that obstetrician gynecologist gave me a lidocaine shot in my cervix, and I didn't feel anything.
Wow. So lidocaine, that's not something that's difficult to get a hold of. That's pretty standard numbing agent. So then in your experience, the lidocaine made it so, and question for you, did the physician just do that? Or did you express concern about the pain previously?
I expressed a lot of concern about the pain with my initial insertion. I asked for painkillers. They said they don't prescribe painkillers for IUD insertions. They gave me another ibuprofen, but when I expressed my concern again at the appointment, the doctor did give me the lidocaine shot.
And the lidocaine, so this needle in your cervix.
Yes.
Did the needle in your cervix hurt?
No.
Interesting. Well, we won't hang out here all day because I could rant about this for a while. But in your case, you had experienced a prior insertion that was painful, and you had to push your practitioner to do something about the pain for them to do
Yes,
it. A lidocaine shot, you said it didn't hurt. So obviously the shot would hurt less than the actual insertion.
significantly less so.
And that is something that every single physician could just do proactively for all women because they know that the insertion is painful, but they are not doing.
Yeah, it worked very well for me when I had the replacement done. So it could be a standard thing that doctors do to make it not painful for people.
Yeah, so would be the first episode where we actually came to a conclusion of a very possible option of what could be done so that women don't have to experience this ridiculous amount of pain upon insertion of the IUD. Because I have spoken to a number of women who said that after actually one of the women who I interviewed, and it wasn't a Pill Reality series episode, it was one of my BAM reality, like a on-air client session. But in that session, she talked about her experience with the IUD. And it was so bad that they tried to insert it, but in her case, they weren't successful, but it had hurt so much that she decided not to get it.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to leave that right there. Okay. So you had the IUD inserted. So maybe you can take us through, because you mentioned you did have a replacement later on. So just kind of share with us then, after you had it inserted, what happened then?
It was painful for about 40 seconds. I felt a little bit off for about a day, not necessarily in pain, but I went for a run that day and I was fine. And generally, I was pretty happy with the copper IUD. It had a few side effects, the ones that are relatively commonly known: increased pain at menstruation and heavier periods.
Okay.
So I think that would be something that women should really take on a case-by-case basis if they are considering a copper IUD. I'm fortunate that I have really easy periods, generally no pain, relatively light flow. So when I got the copper IUD, the increase in pain and flow, it was still manageable. But if somebody had difficult menses to begin with, it might not be a good option.
Well, and so tell us a little bit more. So, pre IUD or, outside of the IUD experience, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being no pain, you're on the beach and everything's wonderful, and 10 being like someone stabbing your abdomen, because that is how I've had women describe the pain of menstruation. Where would you sit without the IUD?
0 to 1.
Okay, so maybe you feel something happening, you feel some degree of cramping, but it's not painful.
Generally, I might have some aching in my hips, maybe a little bit of cramping. It's moderate discomfort, but it wouldn't necessarily be painful.
Okay, and so then when you had the IUD inserted, how would you have rated it then, 0 to 10?
Maybe a 3. On a bad month, I'd take an ibuprofen.
Okay, and then outside of the IUD, did you ever take ibuprofen for?
No.
Okay, so I just want to kind of clarify, because I think that I never want these types of episodes to be like, I'm like a broken record for anyone who's listening to all these episodes. I never want it to be misconstrued. So what I'm trying to do here is just actually gather what the experience was like for you and how it changed. Yeah. Because in the grand scheme of things, for many women, having, no pain move up to very mild pain wouldn't necessarily be an issue. But you make a very important point, which is that for women who do have really painful periods, that's something to consider, because it's not going to make it better.
Yes. So for me, it was fine, but definitely something to consider on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And then I did interview a few women who, and again, this was something that just came up in the interview, who had experienced this random cramping throughout their cycles that was not related to their periods. But in your case, the changes occurred, was it only during your menses, or did you experience anything outside of your menses?
Only during my menses.
Okay.
We'll probably get into my experiences with my hormonal IUD later. That was not the case when I had a hormonal IUD.
Okay.
So when I had a replacement, I was pressured into changing from a copper IUD to a hormonal IUD by the physician that day. And I did have pelvic pain with the hormonal IUD.
Okay, so let's get into that then. I just want to kind of wrap it up. So you had the copper IUD inserted. The insertion was
Yes.
horrible, but then afterwards you experienced the side effects that you mentioned were a bit of your period was a bit heavier, and then the cramping was a little bit more. And you said that you used the copper IUD for 5 years?
Yes, which is the amount of time on the prescription for it. So I kept it for the full amount of time, and I would say I was very satisfied with it.
Okay. And basically what you described, that was the only thing. So it sounds like that was actually quite convenient, and like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Yeah, it was a really convenient. I put it in and didn't worry about contraception for 5 years.
and it obviously worked
Yeah.
because you did not have any unexpected babies. Okay. So then your prescription ran out and then you went back to your doctor. So tell us about that interaction.
So during this period, I moved from Canada to the United States. So the Flexi T was no longer available, but I went to my doctor and asked about getting a Paragard. We did the initial consultation. I got my prescription for ibuprofen, misoprostol. I asked about painkillers, and the nurse practitioner that day was very pushy about giving me antibiotics. I declined to take them because I didn't have them on my initial insert. She couldn't really give me statistics on what the rate of infection was and why I couldn't just wait until I got a fever and symptoms and then take broad spectrum antibiotics. But yeah, I wasn't really keen on taking azithromycin for no reason. So I just didn't take it.
Interesting. And so then you mentioned that this time you kind of pushed your doctor a bit, and then they did give you the lidocaine shot, and
Yes.
the insertion was, you didn't feel anything.
The insertion was fine, except when I went in after taking all of these medications for the insertion, they did a bait and switch. He wouldn't give me the copper IUD we talked about initially.
Okay. Well, okay, we're gonna have to get into that. I wanted.
Okay.
So, did they do the lidocaine shot before they removed the other one? So,
Yes.
Okay, so then you didn't feel the removal of the copper.
No.
Okay, and then
Did not feel.
and you had gone in there to get the copper, the Paragard.
I'd gone in to get a Paragard, and I came out of the office with a Kyleena.
Okay, so share with us then. Okay, so you wanted the Paragard, you wanted the copper. So share what that interaction was like, because you obviously didn't get what you came for.
No, I went into the office, talked about how I'd been satisfied with my previous copper IUD. I'd been looking for a replacement. I was going to go with the US brand of the copper IUD, the Paragard. And right before he went into the office, he said, "Oh, well, a lot of women in my practice have the copper removed. I don't recommend it for women who haven't had children." I was like, "Well, I had one for 5 years. It was fantastic." So he pulled out a Kyleena and he said, "This one is much better." I expressed my concerns about hormonal contraceptives, how I'd had really bad experiences in my early 20s with them, and wanted to stay away from hormonal contraceptives due to the side effects I'd had. I also brought up that there had been several studies on women making different partner choices when they're on hormonal contraceptives. And I was single then, so I wanted to make a good partner choice. My doctor replied to that, "You're going to have bigger problems than disparate major immunohistocompatibility complexes when you're arguing over who has to do the dishes."
That's an interesting response. So for the listeners who may not have any idea what you're talking about or what that word means, there's a lot of research. I think one of the things I've talked about on the podcast before is that we've heard, like, a lot of us have heard that there's a lot of articles going around that say that when you're on hormonal birth control, it can change the person who you choose to be with. Yeah. And so when I was delving into the research, I kind of thought, okay, it's going to be hard. It's going to be slim pickings. Like, I'm going to have to dig deep to like find research about this. But there's this whole field of environmental biology, and there's a lot of research about the major histocompatibility complex, which in a nutshell, the way that we also perceive our partner's attractiveness is largely in part by how we perceive their scent. And so, and it's interesting because there's a part of it that you can control and a part that you can't. So you would smell your partner based on, this major histocompatibility complex, but you also give off certain pheromones. And so when you take the pill, it changes how you perceive that person's scent. And it also changes how you smell to that person. And so then your doctor took all it, like there's, I wouldn't be surprised if there were thousands of papers. There's at least hundreds, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are thousands. Mm-hmm. And so your doctor took all of that research in the field of environmental biology and told you that it doesn't matter when you're fighting over the dishes. That's super condescending.
And I'm an environmental engineer.
So clearly you have no cognitive thinking skills or any background in research or science.
No idea what I'm talking about, obviously.
You shouldn't worry your pretty little head over that, Katherine. It's just too much exertion for, just a lowly little female. My gosh.
So he followed up and said about 25% of the women in his practice who had copper IUDs back within a year and had them removed. Isn't this Kyleena, the hormonal option, much better? So when I expressed my concerns, including partner choice, to the doctor, he was very dismissive. And he said several times that Kyleena and all hormonal IUDs are locally acting. They are not systemic. It is impossible to have those side effects from it.
So that's something that you're not surprised that I pick up on, because I find it to be very interesting, because this is what women are told. And it's very likely that this is how these drugs are marketed to doctors. Because remember, drug companies have to market drugs to doctors so that the doctors will prescribe them to their patients. So it's very likely that the non-medical professionals who market these drugs say things like that. So when you're using a hormone-infused IUD, it is placed in the uterus, and that it's not something you take, obviously in your mouth or get in a shot. But what I always say is, just because the progesterone starts in your uterus doesn't mean we don't have a circulatory system. So it's very strange for anyone to say that the hormone would just stay in your uterus. That's what's impossible. So the hormone is released there, but of course you do have a circulatory system. And so the hormone does go through your entire bloodstream. I don't understand how anyone could even say that, because it's completely inaccurate.
And after I started having side effects that medical professionals would not attribute to the hormonal IUD, but conveniently started at exactly the same time I started taking the IUD, I did a little bit of digging and found the prescribing information. And it looks like the hormones in hormonal IUDs are metabolized in the liver and kidneys.
Well, so that's where hormones are metabolized, right? Well, yeah, that's a complete hogwash. So if anyone's listening and they've been told that fantasy that when you use a hormonal IUD, that it just stays locally and it doesn't, just stays in your uterus, just so that hormones travel through our body in our bloodstream. And that's how, and so there's, for example, if you were to use, one of the things I talk about on the podcast a lot is xenoestrogen exposure and the chemicals that we use on our bodies and in our homes. So think about it. If you could spray some random perfume with estrogenic properties and you can live in the house and breathe that in, and that can go through your bloodstream and alter your hormonal state. If you have a hormone releasing IUD in your uterus, in your actual body, how could you not think that it's going to go through your bloodstream? So it's interesting that this is what medical professionals are saying. So you had the IUD inserted, and a big part of your story, it really sounds as though, you're obviously educated, and you went in there more educated than most women. You had read studies. You knew what the major histocompatibility complex was. You could say it without flinching. It's not, I'm obviously teasing, but that this isn't something that, your average woman would be well read in that area.
No.
And so you went in there with all of that, and you still came out with the IUD against what your intuition was saying.
And you shouldn't need a master's degree to be able to go to a doctor.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you had this experience, and I'll just, yeah, we're kind of hanging out here, but I think it's important
Okay.
because, you know, with medical professionals, there's very much this patriarchal culture where it's kind of like father
Mhm.
daughter, right? So
Yes.
expert, you know, so when you go to a doctor, the doctor is the expert. And depending on the physician that you're working with, some physicians will listen to their patients and hear what they're saying and, you know, modify what they might prescribe or what they might do based on the patient's concerns. And other doctors and physicians and even other health professionals in other fields may not, because they know what's best and they know what works and they're going to push you to do that. So it puts you in a very challenging position, even if you are knowledgeable, because it's if you say, like, first of all, you have the right to say no. You have the right to be like, I don't want that. But in those situations, it's very hard to do so. And I feel like any woman who's been in a situation like that, you really feel like you're being a bad patient, you're being disagreeable, you're being difficult, and you're going to make
Mhm.
him upset, or you're going to, you know what I mean? You want the interaction to remain positive. You want to be nice because that's how we're socialized.
Yeah, you want to be nice, you want the situation to go smoothly. You want to come out of the appointment with some kind of result that you went in for, especially if you've taken all of these medications beforehand. So when your doctor isn't listening to you, they're dismissive, it's very disempowering and it's hard to say no and advocate for yourself in those situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, because someone could easily say, well, you know, you agreed to it and whatever. But I think it's really important to put out there, because I've been in situations like that where I have left the doctor's office with medication, like a prescription for medication that I never filled because I didn't want it,
Mhm.
but I didn't want to have that conversation and go on about it. So I think it's just really important to highlight that, because I know a lot of women have been in that situation. So you got the hormonal IUD, and so share with us some of the side effects you experienced, how long you had it in for, and what eventually led you to have it removed.
So the doctor had told me the only possible side effect was a lighter period. I would still ovulate. I would have a regular period. It would just be lighter.
The
It actually
only,
sounded kind of nice.
the only.
The only one possible.
Okay.
So I had the hormonal IUD inserted and I had spotting for almost 4 months. And then my period just stopped.
Two things that are very, very common side effects that are listed in all of the research literature and even in the packages prescribing information. Just had to say that.
Yes. So I had both of those, which I later learned were very common side effects, and that about almost 25% of women who are prescribed a hormonal IUD will have their period stop.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when you look at the research around IUDs is really interesting. What is often presented to the doctors? So, I mean, at the end of the day, we're kind of ribbing on your doctor here, but you know, your doctor is really trying to look out for you and to do what he or she feels is best. And so
Mm.
this is a theme that's come up a lot on the podcast. It's like what's prioritized in med school is efficacy and the methods that are not user dependent. So the
Yes.
methods that you can't screw up are what are considered to be the best. So less about what would be best for you individually, but more about
Mhm.
kind of across the board, what's going to result in the fewest unplanned pregnancies. And
Right.
so the copper IUD and the hormonal IUD have an extremely high efficacy rate, because at least in part because once you have it inserted, like, it's doing its thing. If you have
Mhm.
an unplanned pregnancy, it's not because you forgot to take your pill or you forgot to come in and get your shot again.
Yeah.
And so your doctor isn't necessarily trying to harm you, but they're actually trying to provide you with the most effective birth control that they believe is going to be helpful. So one of the side effects of IUDs, you know, depending on the type, is the bleeding. And one of the reasons why they infused the IUD with the hormones is to try to minimize some of that, because that would be the number one reason, one of the, at least if it's not the number one, it's one of the top reasons why women ask to have them removed is because who can live their life when you could just start bleeding at the drop of a dime? You know, no one wants to bleed for 6 months or just to bleed randomly all the time. And so it's unacceptable to women. And so part of the reason that doctors often, you know, wish to prescribe the hormonal is because often with the hormonal, eventually even if there is some spotting, eventually it all stops and you just don't bleed at all, which was in your case.
Yes. I had several other side effects as well. Pelvic pain, just at random times during the month. It was worse when I exercised, and I had the hormonal IUD for just over a year and a half, and it got progressively worse and more painful, more longer I had it in for.
And that's something obviously you didn't experience.
Noticed, no, I did not experience that during the copper IUD. I also noticed that my performance at the gym was dramatically decreasing, and I had just generally low energy every day. But I was pretty regular about going to the gym 4 or 5 times a week. And as soon as I went on it, a lot of days I didn't have the energy to go after work anymore. And when I did, I wasn't able to perform to nearly the same level as I had been.
That's really interesting. So during the year and a half that you were using it, were you making these connections, or are these things that you came to afterwards?
The gym one, the athletic performance one, was a connection I made. A lot of the things I made connections about afterwards, but I'd been really loosely tracking my cycle, usually just with cervical mucus. So I had a good idea when I was ovulating, and I would do a lot of my big training days around ovulation because I would get just fantastic performance. And I was essentially stuck at like PMS levels of energy for a year and a half.
Interesting. Just popping into today's episode to remind you that registration is now open for Fertility Awareness Mastery Live. This is my 10-week group coaching program where we take a deep dive into fertility awareness charting to help you achieve your intentions, whether you are currently avoiding pregnancy, trying to conceive, or planning to conceive in the future. We have a spot for you. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to register and reserve your spot today. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. Now let's jump back into today's episode. Well, and what's interesting as well is that there's a lot of discussion around the hormonal IUD because, again, the way that it's marketed, it's kind of like the same way that all the pills are marketed, but the way that it's marketed is that low dose, localized, doesn't go out of your uterus, the hormones stay in there, and also that you get to keep ovulating, and sometimes you lose your period, but your period will be lighter. And so when you look at the research, again, there are different categories that women fall into. So some women do continue ovulating, whether they continue ovulating the whole time they're on it, or they ovulate for a period of time, and then eventually their ovulation becomes disrupted. Some women ovulate sporadically, so it's not regular, but they'll ovulate every now and then. And then other women don't ovulate when they use it. And even women who are ovulating, it's not to say that they're having a normal cycle, because you can't really have a normal cycle when you have artificial hormones in your body enough so that they're preventing you from getting pregnant. So even in the women who are ovulating, when they look at their luteal phase, and this is interesting because it also applies to women who use the copper IUD, because when you use the copper IUD, there's no hormones. So you do keep ovulating and having a period, like literally. But even with the copper IUD, it can negatively impact progesterone production to some degree, and the luteal phase can be a little bit disrupted. It is the least offender of all of them. So, I mean, this is just something due to likely a combination of the localized inflammation. That's part of the reason why the copper IUD works, and part of the reason why you end up having a bit heavier periods and increased pain. So that's one of the ways that it actually works. So in the grand scheme of things, it's helpful to know that, but it's not a big enough thing, I don't think, to dissuade someone from using it, but I think it's still helpful to know. But with the hormonal IUD, the whole concept of you're going to have this continuous dose of hormones in your body and your cycles are just going to be completely non-disrupted is not accurate. So it's interesting that you had the experience, especially with energy, and that you are, I don't know if you're an athlete or if you'd identify as an athlete, but you monitored your performance to the degree that you could actually tell that this had a negative impact on your performance. Yeah. So what finally led you to then come off, have the IUD removed?
One of the other symptoms I was having was vulvovaginitis. So pain, itching, and irritation just would randomly come up. I wouldn't know why. So eventually I went to see the doctor about it, and I saw a nurse practitioner. She said she would swab me for various infections. It's probably not related to the IUD. I asked if we could get it removed because I knew I was having some side effects. She said that was not in her scope of practice. She would swab me and give me the test results. So the test came back negative, and I continued to have symptoms. A few months later, I went in to see an obstetrician and brought up all of the different symptoms that I was having. She assured me that they were in no way related to the IUD. My pelvic pain had been getting quite bad at that point as well. And I was having, at that point, had made a connection between a few mood side effects. I had incredibly low libido on top of the low energy, and I was having issues with anxiety and panic attacks again. But of course, according to my doctor, none of these were related to the IUD. I was still ovulating regularly, so she claimed, and there was nothing wrong with me. I should go home.
Oh, it's all in your head.
It is all in my head. So what I did is I offered to track my cycles. I'd get a basal body thermometer. I'd track my cycles for a month or two, and I'd bring the charts in and we'd go over them together because I didn't think I was ovulating. And she said, "Don't do that. I would never recommend it to anybody. It's so inconvenient."
That's interesting because you were the one that offered to do it.
Exactly. And I brought that up. But
see, that's one of the challenges because it's, you're saying something, you're not being believed. So you're even going out of your way to try to provide evidence, but it's like wrong audience in that case. So then was it this doctor that eventually agreed to remove the IUD, or did you have to go to a different doctor?
No, I asked if she'd remove it, and she said, "You still have 4 years left on it. I'm just going to take it out, and you'll be right back in my office asking for another one in a few months." So a couple of months later, probably 2 months later, I made an appointment with a midwife, and she was skeptical that any of the symptoms I was suffering from were related to the IUD, but she did agree to remove it.
So you went to, am I getting this right? 3 different practitioners. You went to a nurse practitioner, an OB, and a midwife. None of them thought that any of the symptoms could be related to it. But the midwife, even though she was kind of skeptical, was the one that actually agreed to take it out.
Yes.
Huh. And so then what happened when you took it out? Or another question too, was the removal painful? Was that okay?
The removal was fine. It was quick. It was a bit uncomfortable, but I wouldn't call it painful.
Okay. And there was no lidocaine shot provided, and it was okay?
No lidocaine. I didn't even take an ibuprofen. She just pulled it out. It was fine.
Okay. So what happened to the symptoms after you took it out?
They all went away within a month.
All. So you had the vaginitis, you said, so you were having itchy, uncomfortable, you had experienced low libido, you had experienced, I'm trying to remember them all. The low energy, pelvic pain.
My next ovulatory cycle at the gym, my lifts went up by over 20%. The amount that I was able to lift increased by over 20% the next time I ovulated.
That is fascinating. Now I want to look at the research on exercise based on the menstrual cycle, because that's really fascinating. And then the anxiety and panic attacks.
Gone.
Well, I mean, some people could hear this and argue that you're just sensitive to hormones and things like that. I just think that it's important to, I think there is definitely some degree of, bio-individuality, of course, because not all women respond in the same way. And anyone who listens to, if someone were to go listen to all the pill reality series episodes back to back, you would hear that. Some women, they go on the pill and it's nothing, and then the IUD causes them issues. Some women are on the IUD and it's totally fine, but the pill is what causes them issues. So it's really interesting just to hear the bit of bio-individuality. But hopefully this call has at least gotten rid of some, or not gotten rid of, but addressed some of the myths, especially related to the IUD. If so, for the women who do experience symptoms, whether they're similar to yours or different symptoms, I think the most important part of this conversation is that it can be related to the IUD.
Yes.
And even if your doctor is telling you like, no, that is symptom, the IUD is not free of symptoms. It's a hormonal method, and all hormonal methods have potential side effects that you may experience. So for a woman listening who either has an IUD right now and chose this episode because she has been having symptoms and was kind of curious to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing, or just in general, what would you want them to know?
That it's a very individualized thing. And if you do choose to get an IUD, either copper or hormonal, and you start having side effects, if your doctor doesn't believe you, keep going to a different practitioner until you find somebody who does.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, because I mean, I just want to say, I'm sorry that you had such a negative experience with your practitioners. You know, there are doctors who listen to this podcast who are listening right now and who know that, you know, if you were their patient or when they're interacting with their patients, they don't respond in the same ways. So it sounds like you had a string of very difficult doctors. And for a lot of women, having those experiences can turn them off doctors altogether. And so I hope that that's not what happens here, because I've interviewed enough people, enough medical professionals to know that the field is changing and many doctors are starting to kind of get with the program. For the women who have had negative experiences, have been basically gaslighted. So when you have actual symptoms, like we're talking about your physical body, like your vagina was like itchy and sore. Like this is not something you made up on the way there. So when you're having these symptoms and then you're having health professionals basically tell you that it's in your head, it's not related, and all of those types of things, what advice do you have based on your experiences? Or what would you have told your younger self for how to manage and navigate these situations?
I would find alternative healthcare providers wherever possible. An acupuncturist, a naturopath. In my experience, they're a lot more likely to believe you and validate that you are the expert on your own body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, you may not have, it's something you said earlier. You're like, you shouldn't need a master's degree to go see a doctor, which is awesome. But you don't need to read 50 research studies to know how you feel. And if you are experiencing symptoms you did not experience before, or if you have the intuition that something's off. And so, yeah, that's really important that you're the expert in your own body. There's something I just want to say though, because you described going to a nurse practitioner, an OB, and a midwife, and you would think that the midwife would automatically be the one that would be like, yes. So I think it's just important to just keep that in mind. This whole concept of self-advocacy, it never ends.
No.
You know, in different situations. So I'll link in the show notes the episode that I did. I think I called it, how to find a practitioner who will actually help you. But it's a really important, especially for women, because there's just this trend of not really taking us seriously when we're having these symptoms, and hopefully it stops. But until then, we have to be able to advocate for ourselves.
Yeah, it's a challenging situation. And I know I'm not alone in experiencing gaslighting by medical professionals. And unfortunately, this isn't the only situation that I've been in with doctors that just haven't believed me.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I think the last question that's important as well, because there are women who do experience side effects, but we kind of feel like we have to put up with them and tolerate them, at least to some degree, because, if you don't want to get pregnant and you're not in a position where you can get pregnant, a lot of women are absolutely terrified of getting pregnant, and for a lot of very valid reasons. And they know that they can't get pregnant right now. And one of the things that occurs to me, because I live in Canada, is that there's a lot of things that are covered here and that, depending on where you live, that you may have access to that you wouldn't necessarily have access to in other parts of the world. So whereas if someone were to become pregnant and they needed to get the, morning after, or if they had unprotected sex, the condom broke and they needed the morning after pill, you might have access to that. If you were pregnant unexpectedly and needed abortion, you might have access to that. And you might even have that covered by healthcare. Whereas other places in the world, so it for many women, an unplanned pregnancy would be catastrophic for many reasons. So a lot of women are saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but like, I can't get pregnant now. So when you had the IUD removed, were you ready to start trying for a baby? Or were you like, how did you deal with that? Were you just for the women who are like, yeah, but I can't get pregnant.
I wasn't ready to start trying for a baby. I'm still not in a position where I would actively be trying to conceive. But when you look at the statistics on how effective fertility awareness, they're really good. It's a very effective form of contraception. I combine this with condoms, and it's been a year and I haven't fallen pregnant. So condoms are effective. Fertility awareness is effective. So I would say using that potentially in combination with abstinence on certain days is a very effective way to avoid pregnancy.
Okay. Yeah. So in your case, you are actively avoiding pregnancy and taking those precautions. And so for a woman who is just really in that space of like, I hear you, but I'm not ready. And that, first of all, it's okay to be in that space. We do things when we're ready. We all do. We're all on our own individual journeys. And so this is not about, there's not one right decision. Mm-hmm. That's why we have all these options for birth control. So we can choose the one that is best for us at the right time. But for a woman who's in that kind of transition stage where, she's kind of working up to it, she knows that she may want to consider coming off of her hormonal birth control, but she's really nervous. What, if anything, would you want to say to her?
That just make the best decision for you. I've been on a lot of different types of contraception over the years. Fertility awareness is the only one that doesn't have side effects, but any decision that you're making that is effective for your situation is the right one. Mm-hmm. Whether that's the pill or a hormonal IUD or a copper IUD, there's going to be trade-offs between your health and side effects and effectiveness, and only the user of that contraception can make the decision about what's right for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great words to end on. I think that it's important I think part of it too, and part of what I get into with all of the reality sessions that I air is that, if you are ready for this and if you've had that conversation with yourself and you feel like this is the right choice for you, you can do it and you can do it successfully. You're a capable adult. You do a lot of complicated things in your life. So you're capable of preventing pregnancy without hormones if that's what you desire. It's interesting how many women don't feel confident in their ability to do that.
And I noticed once I started actively tracking my cycles every day, it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. And the patterns of when I'm ovulating and when I'm fertile, for me, were very clear immediately.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's not always the case, obviously, but the thing about cycles is that that's what they are. They're cycles. And so although you can't predict when you're going to ovulate, once you start to see what your body looks like when you're in your fertile window versus when you're not, and you experience it, because it happens over and over and over again. It's not always exactly the same, but it's biology. So when you're in your fertile window, you're going to show cervical fluid. Your cervix is going to change position. Once you ovulate, the cervical fluid is going to go away or drastically reduce, and your cervical position is going to change again, and your temperature is going to go up. If you're paying attention to your body, you're going to notice other signs. A lot of women notice different signs that they only see post-ovulation, whether it's emotional, whether it's physical, breast tenderness or whatever the case. So there's a lot of things that you start to identify that make it easier and easier to identify the difference between your fertile window and when you're out. Yeah. So that's not something you would know. And it's not something you can read in a book. It's something that you gain from the experience of actually charting and tracking your cycles and paying attention.
And that brings me to one of the other major benefits of tracking my cycles is I feel I'm much more in tune with my body. So even if you're not using it as a
primary form of contraception, just the amount of body awareness and body literacy that listening to my body through tracking my cycles has given me has been a fantastic growth experience. And I think I'm a healthier person for it.
Well, I can attest. It's really interesting what happens when you track it, because then you can't help but just notice. And again, I'm really fascinated by the fact that you were tracking your exercise, and not just exercise, but your performance and how it changed throughout the cycle. There's a lot of people talking about, hacking the cycle now, and the way that I've seen it for the most part is your energy levels and your level of extroversion versus introversion, like when you want to do things, outwardly versus just hanging out by yourself. But just the very thought that your athletic performance, and it makes a lot of sense based on the hormonal changes. But I think that is a fascinating tidbit for all the listeners to take away. So, Katherine, I can't thank you enough for being here today and sharing your story with us and your experiences. I'm sorry that you had to have such negative experiences with practitioners. I hope that you have a good team around you now. I hope that you have some excellent practitioners who've been supporting you through this. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I've developed an excellent team of practitioners around me. I'm dating an acupuncturist. I've been working with naturopaths, and coming off hormonal contraception was a really great experience working with a team of providers that I really trust.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/295. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Katherine. It was really eye-opening, and so many important pieces of Katherine's story came to light. And for anyone who's listening who's ever had a challenging experience with a health practitioner either not believing you or not taking you seriously, if you did have issues with hormonal birth control method or anything else for that matter, I'm sure that you could relate to Katherine's story. And I think that what we can take from today's interview is just that we really have to take it upon ourselves to get as much information as we can about any medication that we take, any hormonal birth control method that you are using. And we really have to tune into our own intuition and really begin to trust that. One of the reasons why I am so passionate about sharing fertility awareness charting and just really getting in tune with what's happening in your cycle and your body is that one of the things that comes out of that the process of charting and staying in tune to your body is that you start to gain confidence in your own intuition and your own feelings, to the point that, if you've charted your cycles for years, you have a record of what is normal for you, and you've been paying attention all these years. So you become really aware of what is typical for you, what makes sense for you in your cycle, in your health, in the way that you feel, in your energy levels. And if something does go off, or if something happens where you recognize that something, isn't okay, then you're less likely to ignore that. I find that the process of charting and developing body literacy helps you to just gain confidence in whatever it is that's happening with you. And it's one of those kind of ideals that you eventually become the expert in your own body. And even if you're working with somebody who, doesn't necessarily take your symptoms seriously or isn't really responding in the way that you wish that they would, you are still able to trust your own intuition, and seek that help until you are heard, until you do find the practitioner who is willing to listen and is willing to support you. So I hope that is what you took from, that's one of the things anyways, one of the takeaways that you took from today's episode, because really that is one of the most important things that all of us can do for ourselves, which is really become in tune with our own bodies, our own intuition, and to trust that, to really listen to those little whispers. This doesn't feel right, or I feel like there's something wrong here, and not just ignore it and dismiss it. Because when we don't listen to the whispers, it's not like they just go away. They actually turn into screams and yells and louder, more problematic symptoms in the future. So with that said, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. If you were waiting for the last minute to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery. It has arrived. This is officially the last call. If you're listening to this episode in real time, we are starting this program on Tuesday, which is just a few days from now. And as long as the page is still up, the program page with the register now button, as long as that's still live, we still have spots left. At the time I'm recording, I still have 2 spots available. And so I am recording a little bit in advance. So we'll have to take a peek on the day of this episode goes live. But this is officially the last call to join us in the January 2020 round of Fertility Awareness Mastery. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to register, and get in right under the wire if you were really wanting to be part of our group this year. And so with that said, thank you so much for tuning into the show, for supporting Fertility Friday, for sharing the episodes with your friends. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.